Year 1287 BCE, a river bend under a sky the color of old linen. Dawn pushed light across mud brick and reed mat, and the air smelled of wet papyrus and stale incense. On a raised platform outside the Temple of the Two Seasons, a woman stood barefoot on sun-warmed stone, her feet dusted with the grit of the riverbank, and a wooden plaque hung from her neck with painted signs that announced her crime. Her name was Taia, age 28, widow and reedworker, and the plaque read a single word that would follow her into the afterlife and the archives of the temple, a word that marked her as adulteress. The crowd murmured like wind through date palms. This was not a private punishment. It was a ritual with a language of law and theology that turned personal shame into institutional spectacle. Today, we will trace the law papers hidden in the granary archives, read the brittle lines of a papyrus that recorded the verdicts, examine the grave goods removed from a burial that confirms the punishment, and show how medical instructions preserved in scribal manuals taught temple physicians to treat and to keep wounds visible as proof. If you want to understand how a legal theology made a woman into a public sign, subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. First, we will open the tribunal record that set the ritual in motion and hold the first fragment of the papyrus up to the light. The legal and theological framework that permitted this kind of punishment was not an accident, but a system. The concept at the heart of the tribunal was mahat, a word that combined order, purity, and cosmic balance. In the theology of the temple, the social body mirrored the cosmos, and any disruption of kin bonds or sexual fidelity was cast as a rupture with the divine order. Priests and judges interpreted mahat through a set of rules that belonged both to jurisprudence and to ritual practice. Laws were neither purely secular nor wholly sacred. A verdict of adultery could be born from sworn testimony, one witness, or from an accusation by a husband or master, and then framed as a breach that required purification not only to restore household property, but to reassure temples that the annual cycle would not fail. Documentary evidence for this comes in lists recorded by scribes on papyrus rolls held in temple archives, and in a handful of decrees carved into limestone at provincial shrines. These documents categorized offenses into degrees and paired each degree with a prescribed sequence of actions that combined corporal marking, exile, and ritual cleansing. Priests' judges like Keti invoked myths where gods themselves were purified after transgression to justify severe measures against those deemed to have broken sacred bonds. The scribe Amenhotep carefully copied the procedural lines so they would be available to officials in distant nomes. The language in the papyri was precise and ritualistic. It named time frames and objects to be used and reserved certain treatments to temple hands and temple workshops. To understand why Taia was made visible, we must see how law and theology endorsed visibility as proof. Testimony in this system had evidentiary value not only when articulated, but when embodied. A visible mark served as a perpetual testimony that the household and the temple had done what they believed necessary to preserve mahat. This ideological structure was reinforced by economic interests. Temples gained laborers from punished families, property transfers followed public shaming, and scribes' copies of the verdicts justified seizure and redistribution. The priesthood and the tribunal were thus not merely arbiters of morality, they were administrators of property and order. Cataloging the punishments reveals a taxonomy of marks and fates designed to signal meaning to a watching public. There were 4 principal categories: marking, branding, or tattooing of the forehead or hand; exposure, which meant prolonged public display, often at a temple gate or market; physical mutilation, usually limited to public scars; and final disposals, including exile, servitude, or execution. Each category carried a purpose. Marking served to keep identity visible across space and time. It transformed the body into a text legible to neighbors and officials. Exposure intended humiliation and deterrence, a slow unmaking of social standing through continual public gaze. Mutilation functioned as both punishment and permanent evidence. Dispossession through exile, servitude, or forced labor in mines removed a person from kin networks and converted them into economic units. These mechanisms were justified through ritual language that equated the mark with purification. A marked body was explained as a body that had been processed through the temple and thus safe for the remainder of society. The recorded punishments also included procedural notes on the tools used and the officials permitted to carry them out. For example, a list in the temple inventory named the iron file and the copper needle as instruments of branding and tattoo, along with the incense and saline used to ensure the mark remained visible. A neighboring decree spelled out that exposure should take place at noon on market days for 3 successive festivals to maximize observation and reinforce the spectacle as a means of social repair. The theological rhetoric repeatedly used terms such as purification, mark, tribunal, and order, invoking the idea that the community's stability required these tangible signs. In practice, these punishments were neither uniformly applied nor random. The choices reflected social standing. Elite women could be moved into controlled forms of exposure where their presence in ritual spaces was managed, while plebeian women often faced harsher raw displays. The link between punishment type and social consequence made visible how law served both metaphysical and material aims. The spaces where these punishments took place were themselves instruments of institutional power. The public platform outside the temple was built of stone slabs warmed by the sun and edged with shallow channels where offerings could be washed away. Small holding rooms beneath the east wing had barred openings and benches for subjects to wait under the watch of temple guards. Mines at the desert edge and servitude workhouses were located beyond the city walls in barren places where the sounds of labor could be contained. A detailed description of the tribunal precincts appears in a ledger kept by a scribe, mentioning the orientation of the platform toward the rising river, the carved inscription indicating authority, and the chained ring in which shamed individuals could be fastened. Archaeological reports note similar features in provincial shrines, remains of platforms with troughs and traces of organic matter consistent with offerings and disinfectants. The temple workshop contained a room lined with jars of salt, herbal preparations, and linen strips, its floor embedded with darkened stains from oils and pigments used to paint plaques that announced verdicts. The architecture reinforced hierarchy. A narrow corridor leading from the holding room to the platform forced a single-file procession. The crowd could not approach from behind, and priests had an elevated pathway that removed them from direct contact. Evidence from excavations suggests that certain rooms doubled as medical assessment chambers, where basic procedures were carried out under clerical supervision. The feel of these spaces mattered. Stone surfaces retained cold even in heat. The smell of resin and animal glue clung to ropes. The clink of metal rings echoed in the stairwells, and voices were designed to carry outward toward plazas. The museum fragments that remain record rope loops, iron shackles, and a wooden signboard with traces of painted ink, all corroborating a system that made place into performance. The ritual of purification was not a single moment, but a sequence designed to inflict suffering while maintaining theological coherence. Temple manuals and a fragmentary papyrus outline protocols that unfold in stages. Days 1 to 5 were assessment and confinement. The accused was examined, the priest-physician documented visible signs, and a scribe recorded statements. Instructions required that wounds be washed with a saline and herbal solution, but not closed completely in order to keep the mark legible and painful. Days 6 to 10 involved public exposure with the plaque displayed at market entrances and at the temple gate during ritual hours. Those days emphasized the acoustic elements of the ritual. Drums were struck, and the priest recited a litany that framed the punishment as restoration of order. Days 11 to 15 escalated punitive measures for cases deemed unrepentant or for whom testimony suggested deeper transgression. At this stage, marks might be deepened or a portion of property seized and redistributed. Each phase included checklists for officials and signatures for accountability by the judge and the priest. A procedural description preserved in a museum collection notes how the saline solution for cleansing was mixed 1 part salt, 2 parts boiled river water, and a handful of crushed frankincense. The mixture applied and allowed to dry so that it kept the tissue raw. This technical note is concise but precise, and it shows the interplay of healing and display. Another technical passage describes how a wooden plaque was treated with soot and resin so that painted letters would not flake. The plaques fastened with hemp cord and hung with a string of beads so that they struck the chest with every movement, becoming an audible marker. These stages were intentionally staged to allow for observation, report, and ratification by multiple officers, thereby transforming private accusation into a sealed institutional action. At the center of this system was a case that illuminates how doctrine met flesh. Taia had been a reed worker who repaired boats and wove baskets. The backstory of her life helps us see why her punishment mattered to her community. She was born beside a canal. Her mother, Nefret, taught her to weave and to read the simple signs used by market stall keepers. As a girl, she learned the noises of the river and the names of the birds. Her father, Passer, died in a flood when she was 12, and she took on the role of managing the household, which made her work visible to neighbors who later would be summoned as witnesses. She married once, but the marriage dissolved when grain shortages came, and she was left with a small plot and a son named Hor. The death of her husband left her vulnerable to local power brokers who coveted her plot. In the years before her accusation, she had worked in the temple workshops sharing tasks with a woman named Mahet, and she had a brief liaison with a man named Ramos who was employed by a local official. Rumors later described a quarrel over money and property. Taia's social world was small but connected through kin and labor networks. When the accusation arrived, it intersected with family grief, economic pressure, and public anxieties about order. These paragraphs sketch the contours of her life, so we may not see her merely as a label, but as a person whose actions were embedded in relationships, institutions, and material scarcity. The accusation itself unfolded in the tribunal like a ritual drama. The scene on the platform involved at least 8 exchanges across several participants, and their words are preserved in fragmentary entries and oral memory reconstructions. The exchanges began with the judge, Merer, reading the charge and calling the witnesses. "State your name and what you saw," he asked the first witness, the fisherman Horem, who answered in a voice roughened by salt. "I saw Taia at dusk by the canal. She met Ramos and they left together." Merer turned to the scribe, Amenhotep. "Record the time and place." Amenhotep dipped his reed and wrote. Taia spoke next, her voice thin with fear. "I went to ask for work, and I was not alone with him. I sought his help to move a boat." Merer responded, "Work is not what we hear. You are accused of breaking the house and the order of Mahat." The priest Keti stepped forward. "The goddess must be untainted. The household must be purified." Nefret Taia's sister cried out, "She is a widow. She cares for Hor. Do not take her from us." Ramos said, "I offered no transgression, only labor and bread." Merer looked at the crowd, and his voice lowered. "Witnesses speak in public. Truth does not hide. If the temple sees fit to mark this woman, we must obey." Taia then pleaded, "I ask mercy and a chance to work back and to make offerings to keep our family intact." Keti replied, "Mercy requires acknowledgement of the mark as proof. The gods are appeased." The scribe Amenhotep signed the decree. These exchanges display the tension of multiple claims, public and private, religious and material, and the outcome hinged on the tribunal's will to make the private visible. The execution of the ritual that followed involved named secondary actors and technicians whose roles documented the complicity of professionals. The temple physician Sobek prepared the saline and described its effects, saying in a recorded note, "The solution debrides the tissue yet allows inflammation to persist, ensuring the mark remains evident." This technical explanation shows how medical expertise was mobilized not to heal fully but to maintain evidence. The guard Horam, whose earlier testimony had been decisive, secured cords and a wooden plaque that the workshop assistant Mahet painted with black soot to highlight the lettering. Ramos's complicity was recorded in a ledger showing he received a portion of land that had been reassigned after the verdict. The official Ramos appears in lists of redistributed plots, suggesting that economic incentive informed accusations. Other names appear in the archive, including the overseer Amun, who certified that the exposure took place during 3 market festivals, and the scribe Amenhotep, who copied the official wording into multiple rolls. The presence of these individuals in the documentary corpus underlines the social network that turned accusation into action. There are at least 2 moments of tension that crystallize the moral stakes and the human cost. The first occurs when Taia is led from the holding room onto the platform and sees her son Hor. A silence fell. The sun cut across the plaque and the beads clipped against her chest like seeds. For an instant, the crowd forgot the litany. Then a murmur rose, and the priest resumed. This pause shows the collision of law and family life, and the shock of a child who will record his mother's mark for life. The second moment is in the temple archive years later when a young scribe named Evie finds the roll that holds Taia's case. He reads the ledger. The ink has bled in places, and the scribe falters in his pen. He decides to add a small marginal note, not authorized by his superiors. She was a reedworker. Her son still lives. The insertion is a quiet act of remembrance that risks censure but preserves a human trace. Both moments are short, but they hold the most intense moral friction of the entire story as public doctrine meets private memory. Other cases in neighboring nomes show variations that reveal social stratification and political manipulation. A noblewoman named Sinet suffered a controlled exposure where her plaque was hung in a private courtyard, and she performed a public apology before the goddess in a ritual that allowed her to keep property rights. Contrast this with a plebeian woman named Iset, who was stripped publicly of her weave tools and sent to forced labor in the desert quarry. In Sinet's case, the priesthood and local magistrate coordinated so that the spectacle affirmed elite status while minimizing actual economic loss. In Iset's case, the spectacle served as a mechanism of labor supply and property reallocation. Records also show times when accusations were used as weapons in land disputes. A family ledger from the nome of Adulteress lists a dispute over irrigated plots where an accusation of adultery replaced arbitration and the accuser received the plot after the conviction. These patterns indicate that the institution of punishment did not operate in a vacuum. It interfaced with kinship politics, economic scarcity, and local rivalries, making the Mahat a tool of social regulation and redistribution. The tribunals that pronounced verdicts did so with legal rhetoric, yet their outcomes often resembled transactions in local economies. The connections to the present are unsettling. Elements of ritualized public shaming persist in legal language and social practices, even when laws have modernized. Contemporary statistics on gender-based violence reveal that public humiliation and social exclusion remain tools used to control women in some communities. Modern legal frameworks sometimes retain vestiges of moralizing language that allow for differential treatments by judges and officials. Comparative studies show how punitive visibility continues to function as deterrence in societies where the social body is imagined as a moral community. International reports document cases where women accused of moral transgressions face stigmatization that results in loss of housing, employment, and access to services, outcomes that echo the economic dispossession of ancient cases. The continuity is not literal but conceptual. When law makes the body a site of evidence, and when public discourse demands visible proof of repentance, the mechanisms that permit institutionalized punishment of women remain available. This is why recovering cases like Taia's matters today. Archaeological and documentary work helps reveal patterns that are not simply tales of the past, but blueprints that authorities have adapted across centuries. The modern stakes are clear. Advocacy and reform require attention to how symbolic penalties translate into material harms and how legal language can enable private interests to exploit public institutions. At approximately one-third into this narrative, we pause to recognize the emotional weight of these findings. If this history leaves you with a sense of shock or sadness, you are not alone. These stories challenge what we think we know about ancient societies and ask us to reckon with the living legacies of punitive seizure and public shaming. Write in comments the city where you are watching and one word that captures your reaction, for example, rage, sorrow, disbelief. Each comment helps surface these histories to broader audiences and builds a community of witness. Your response matters because it signals that these narratives belong in public memory and that we can press institutions to reckon with inherited practices. Now we return to the evidence and to the technical records that underwrote the punishment of Taia and others. The technical procedures recorded in the temple manuals warrant precise description. The first procedure described is the preparation of the cleansing solution, which combined measured proportions of boiled river water, a handful of salt, and crushed aromatics, boiled together until a residue formed. This residue, applied to wounds, ensured ongoing inflammation, making the mark visible and painful. This practice balanced antiseptic intent with evidentiary necessity. A second procedure details the making of the wooden plaque, where seasoned cedar was planed to a flat surface coated with soot and resin. The inscriptions painted in mineral pigments that resisted weather. The plaque then tied with hemp cord and a ring of beads so that it struck the chest, producing an audible reminder. A third technical note explains the temple physician's role during public exposure. The physician was required to document the state of tissue, to certify that the mark remained legible, and to sign a record that would be stored in the priestly archive. Each of these technical descriptions clarifies the professional involvement and shows how medicine, ritual, and bureaucracy were braided in service of institutional punishment. There are three moments of heightened tension that must be underscored and explored. The first arose when village laborers refused to fasten the plaque to Taia, claiming they would not be complicit in branding someone without incontrovertible proof. For a time, the tribunal faltered. Negotiations ensued with officials offering bread and barley to secure labor. This standoff exposed the moral calculus of witnesses and the marketplace. The second tense moment happened when a neighboring magistrate threatened to intervene for political gain and demanded a rehearing if the tribunal did not yield certain land titles. The priesthood and the tribunal confronted the possibility of losing authority and so doubled down on ritual visibility, which escalated the severity of the punishment. The third occurred months later when Taia's son was pulled out of the register by an official claiming he was property of the temple because his mother had been marked. This administrative move attempted to sever kinship continuity and to appropriate child labor for temple workshops, and it produced a private resistance within the family that made the subsequent small acts of memory all the more fraught. Each of these moments produced new records and marginal notes that reveal the multi-party conflicts at the heart of institutional punishment. The human consequences extended beyond immediate suffering to intergenerational damage. Genealogies show that children of punished women lost inheritance rights or were assigned lower status in village registers. Taia's son, Hora, later appears in a ledger as a labor apprentice in the temple workshop, his name annotated with a marginal mark that scholars interpret as a sign of reduced legal standing. Property transfers recorded after Taia's case show a parcel of land moving from her small plot into the holdings of the official Ramos and then into the temple estate, a shift that deprived her kin of agricultural sustenance. These consequences echoed across decades, shaping family fortunes and memory. Complicity by professionals mattered. Physicians, scribes, guards, and priests who signed records or carried out procedures lent institutional legitimacy to outcomes that benefited certain actors and harmed others. The existence of documentary evidence is both a source of historical reconstruction and a reminder of institutional capacity to standardize injustice. We close with a temporal epilogue that follows the aftermath at 3 moments. 1 month after the ritual, Taia was alive, though marked and removed from the central civic registers. The plaque hung in the market until it was weathered and then stored in a temple chest. Her sister Nefret visited, bringing small offerings and soft bread. The grief was immediate. Neighbors whispered, and the son Hor slept on the roof to avoid the gaze of other children. The family economy contracted, and a temple ledger shows a modest allotment of grain given to the household, a small attempt at subsistence that could not fully compensate for the loss of rights and social standing. This first month captured the acute shock, the immediate redistribution, and the ritual residue that lingered in the daily life of kin who had to navigate markets, temples, and neighbors with the mark as an open secret. 3 months later, the social consequences had hardened. A hearing had assigned a portion of Taia's land to Ramos, and he had begun to cultivate it with hired hands. The community had largely absorbed the spectacle into routine talk, and the plaque was seldom brought out, though the mark on Taia remained a private and public sign. Hor had been apprenticed in the temple workshop, and his name appeared in the register under a different status than before the accusation. A small group of village women had begun bringing tokens to the archive, hoping to see any redaction or clemency, yet the priesthood maintained that the ritual satisfied the gods. 6 months after the event, the matter had become an archive entry, a referenced precedent used by magistrates in later disputes. Taia's medem appeared in other roles as an example of the tribunal's authority, and new complaints used her case as proof of the consequences of transgression. Yet in the margins, a few scribes and one anonymous hand had added notes of sympathy and small drawings of a reed basket, perhaps recalling Taia's craft. The institutional memory had congealed into law and local custom, even as private memory continued in small acts of resistance and remembrance. In sum, Taia is not an isolated case, but a lens through which we can see how law, theology, medicine, and economy collaborated to create systems of public punishment. The ritualized adulteress procedure transformed a private accusation into a permanent social marker and facilitated resource transfers while claiming the work was for cosmic order and purification. Archaeological fragments, papyrus rolls, and temple inventories converge to show the procedural specificity and the human complexity of these practices. Remembering such cases matters because they teach us to look for institutional patterns that hide behind ritual language and to recognize how law can be used to enforce inequalities. If this story moved you, subscribe for more investigations that bring documents and bones into conversation and amplify forgotten names. Share this video so these histories enter public memory, and write the city you are watching from and one word describing your reaction below. They try to turn a person into a sign. Our obligation is to restore persons to the record and to insist that institutions be held to account for the marks they leave on lives.